Good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and just get started, and I'll continue to let folks in if they pop into the waiting room. But I'm Nora from the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative. I think I've had the opportunity to engage with all of you. And we are thrilled to have the opportunity today to have a conversation, nurturing and norming inclusive assessment practices, democratically engaged assessment. So thrilled to have Sarah, Joe, and Patti here to share some of their work. I will say that several years ago, I found the white paper that you all had worked on democratically engaged assessment, and I found myself reading it and just continually going, yes, oh my gosh, this is amazing, and emailing Sarah and saying, this is such a useful collection of resources, like thinking, and I've drawn so much from that in a lot of my own work. So I'm excited to dive into the conversation and learn from you all today. I just wanted to share with everyone, we are recording just to make sure we have this as a tool that might be useful after the fact, and we'll work with Patti, Sarah, and Joe to think about parts or how they want to use that as well. So with that, I will turn over to Sarah to introduce your co-facilitators and the topic for today.
All right, thank you so much, Nora. It's such a pleasure to be here and with familiar faces that we're all we've thought with before, and we've had an opportunity to collaborate with before. So hopefully this will be some new stuff, some past stuff, and a nice reinforcement of the work that we've talked about together. So for those of you, I think I know everyone, but I'm Sarah Stanlick. You know me from collaborative land and our wonderful network, and then also as a faculty member at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And I'm really fortunate to be here with my colleagues from our National Imagining America Collaborative, assessing the practices of public scholarship. And so Patti and Joe might be familiar faces to some of you as well, I'm sure, and they'll introduce themselves in a moment. So if it's not a problem for folks, I think everybody's got cameras on, engaged, ready to go. For those who aren't, if you can at some point, that would be wonderful, just because we're hoping this is an interactive kind of discussion and back and forth. So without further ado, I'm going to make the space for Joe and Patti to introduce themselves before we get into it. So Joe, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Joe Bandy. I teach in sociology and help run the Center for Teaching at Vanderbilt University. And yeah, I've been involved with the Imagining America research group on apps on assessment for, gosh, a decade now, it seems, and was co-chair for several years as we produced this document that you'll see later.
Yeah.
And I'm Patti Clayton. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, I am in beautiful Springland, North Carolina. It's been fun to be home this spring and watch the spring come to the state. I've been doing experiential learning, service learning, community campus engagement for about 20 years, with a particular focus the last 10 years or so on democratic engagement. And that's what brought me into collaboration with the apps folks at Imagining America. And we drew on the work on democratic engagement and developing this work on democratically engaged assessment, obviously. And I collaborate with Joe and Sarah and the rest of the apps team, and with other folks around the country on projects related to civic learning. Been doing a little bit recently on, well, as everybody has, on taking community engaged learning online. I don't know what else. That's good. That's me.
It's great
vast
to have,
and manifold.
Exactly. It's great to have such a wide breadth of things that Patti works on, that it's like, which things am I going to talk about today? So thank you both for being here with me. So, as Patti and Joe alluded to, we are this assessing the practices of public scholarship collaborative. We are working together over, some of us years, some of us decades, thinking in this space about ways to kind of reimagine assessment in ways that are more inclusive, that promote belonging, that are more values engaged. APPS is a collection of scholar practitioners. We work together to rethink the ways in which we are being asked to assess assess our work, the ways that we authentically assess our work, and the ways we think about telling our stories in collaborative with our community partners, within our classrooms, within ourselves. And so APPS began as this research group because there's all these unanswered questions and stressors around our assessment practices. So we wonder, is our work having impact in communities? How can I assess the ways in which we're working in ways that are consistent with my values? How can we make sure it's rigorous and it's collaborative and it's engaging full participation with the people that we work with closely? And then we also wondered, how can I help transform my institution, my practices, and myself via this assessment, right? People are always a little bit nervous about assessment, but it also provides this tremendous pathway. So to kick us off and to kind of ask everybody to share their own experiences, we have put together a couple of questions as well as this lovely little link, which Joe is going to put a link in our chat and you can navigate to ask, just as a start off, what is your experience with assessment? It can be a couple of words, it can be a sentence, but if we could ask you to navigate over to the Google Doc, I will come out of here so we can see the answers as they populate. And let's start a little bit of a discussion. All right. There we go. Done. People are chuckling. Do people not find this thrilling? Excellent. Ooh, some interesting words. Okay, more research than assessment, Maureen. Daunting. But daunting question mark. Danielle, I want to follow up on that. All right. Yeah, and you guys can hold off on the other columns. We're not asking everybody to fill out everything right now, but just kind of those first three, just as kind of introduction, kind of your affiliation, and then one word or one thought. So it seems like we've got some good things going on here. Some, daunting question mark, agnostic, tension-filled, engaged, conflicted. Laura's speaking to the exploration, the potentials and the possibilities that are here. I said thrilling, a little cheeky, but the more we've gotten into this work, the more exciting and just opportunities filled, I think I've found it. So thank you so much for engaging in that. So we'll go back to the PowerPoint just to kind of show here's what we've heard, because we've been working on this obviously for a couple of years, we mentioned, and when we've asked this question in other audiences, we're getting a lot of the same feedback that you all are giving us, right? It's multivariate. So there's this expert-driven idea that, assessment is done either from an outside group that comes in and assesses for you, or it's something that you have to have a lot of experience in to be able to be allowed to assess. It could be disempowering for some. One of my favorites a couple of years ago at IA, people physically acted out the idea of rigor and rigor mortis. So it's something that's constraining, that makes it feel like it's inauthentic and that it's stifling. But others think of it as enlightening, right? Solitary, something that could be post hoc. A lot of people think of assessment as something done at the end. And so the experiences and stories that we draw on to affirm that assessment is too often experienced as a top-down, managerial, bureaucratic, required, not terribly helpful activity. It's a task to check off, a checkbox in a long series of all the other things that we're expected to do. And we've heard from folks saying, I'm tired of counting hours, counting dollars, counting heads. I'm not here to only document and justify my own existence. I'm in this because I care about contributing to change. And oftentimes, assessment doesn't feel like you're contributing to that change. It imposes priorities that are not aligned with or are at odds with the goals for learning, engagement, and change. And especially in this field of global service learning, global community-based learning, we know that there are a lot of things that end up being at odds with the work that we hope to be doing. And then finally, too often it discourages us and makes us want to surrender. In the words of Parker Palmer, we end up getting shut down or feeling the shutdown and going along with processes of assessment that seem inauthentic, besides the point, or undermining our work. All right. So this is just a little bit of what we're going to go through today. We're kind of seeing this as a webinar in movements. First movement being framing the discussion around connecting DEA to this community-based global learning, the field and the work that we're in. Secondly, we'll move and we'll think through kind of illuminating that shutdown that Parker Palmer talks about. What is the challenge at hand? What are the ways in which expectations about our identity, power differentials, empowerment shape our assessment contexts? And then we're going to move into shifting the explanation of DEA and a promising path forward. So what is this framework that we're talking about? What are the essential components? And how do we move forward together? And throughout, I encourage you all to just keep bringing kind of your own expectations, your contexts into the process. So if you have examples that you kind of want to unpack, there are going to be plenty of opportunities to do that as well. All right. So just to kind of get us into the space that we're in and the one framework that we're all very comfortable with on this call, fair trade learning. So fair trade learning is that global educational partnership exchange. It prioritizes reciprocity in relationships through cooperative cross-cultural participation in learning, service, and civil society. I will not continue to read this entire definition, but I just wanted to kind of center us and make sure that we were thinking in the same respects of the work that we do is collaborative. And at its core, we're working together with real people in real communities to achieve ends of transformation towards kind of the just, equitable, sustainable world that we all are hopefully envisioning together. What that looks like looks different to different folks. But ultimately, I think when we're working in these partnerships, we're working towards kind of a shared vision of the future. So when we talk about DEA, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, it's values engaged, and those values can be fair trade learning. So if we are saying that we have a set of principles, if we have a rubric, if we have ideas towards the way in which our work should be going, how are we checking in? How are we asking those questions about whether or not we're meeting those goals and those standards? So DEA can be a framework and a set of tools that can help us to assess, evaluate, reflect on those goals. We talk very often in this space about being aspirationally decolonial. What does that look like in practice? Where are those spaces within our work that we can ask those questions about whether or not that's what we're actually doing here? And what does that look like? What evidence do we have that we're moving towards that? And then finally, DEA can be a way of asking questions about stakeholders, about power, about stories of our work in ways that help us realize, again, that just, ethical, and sustainable vision for the world. All right, with that, we're gonna recenter, I'm gonna stop talking, and recenter us to the Google Doc that we have shared access to. So my question for those on the call, what has your experience of assessment been in community-based global learning? Where do you feel that assessment is most inclusive, and what helps it to be that way? So if we can navigate back over, I think there's a column, and we also would encourage people to, think about this, but then feel free to kind of share in. What is your context been like? Right. Yep. Thank you, Joe. Just columns D and E for now. And if anybody has a really good example or something that they want to share kind of out loud with the group, I think that would be fantastic too. So I'm seeing focus on student engagement. Tiffany, I really like your sharing. You guys are kind of at the start of it. So this is an opportunity to maybe building from the ground up or thinking through from the outset how to, you know, imbue kind of some of these values and approaches to the work.
Exactly.
Excellent. Right. And what office are you in at Mount Holyoke?
I lead the Graduate and Professional Education Division.
Okay, excellent. So ends up being a lot of internships, co-ops, service learning, different types of experiential learning?
We actually do more work across bringing international scholars to our campus, and we're working on how can we expose our graduate students and professional development folks to more opportunities out there in the world. I would say it falls more in the realm of professional development than credit bearing, largely for what we're doing.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. And the folks on this call are coming from all different backgrounds. So some of it's about student learning, some of it's more focused on kind of community engaged partnerships and partnership development and nurturing. There's credit bearing, non-credit bearing. We can talk at some point about a toolkit that is an open curriculum access resource for folks. So yeah, this is a good network to be a part of. All right. Does anybody want to, you know, talk about their experience a little bit? Talk about the example that they decided to share in the Google Doc?
It's actually a privilege to be in a small group with you all today, because we'll really get to talk. Which, just as a side note, I've been watching apps emergence from afar for a while. I've definitely never had the chance to sit with you all, so thanks for spending time today. So I put down, in terms of the experience, that, and this is no shock, but institutionally, it's just so much easier to leverage capacities toward student learning assessment than toward community organizational, any kind of assessment. And feeling inclusive moments of assessment. First of all, I really appreciated that question, and it sounded a little bit challenging. It made me think about these moments that we've had in two networks I've been a part of in the last, decade and more, where we invited partners from around the world to gather in one location. And so with the nonprofit Amazaji, it was in Pittsburgh, and then with Haverford College, it was in Haverford. And then once there, we were talking with one another conversationally about a set of themes. And through that, actually some of that is behind the emergence of fair trade learning as a concept, right? You get sort of generative understanding together, but I put in my little spot in that grid, that Excel sheet as well. We weren't exactly systematic about what maybe our frames around assessment would have imagined, but we were clearly creating community and knowledge through discourse.
Yeah. Well, as I was trying to frame out today and think about how to enter into this discussion too, I was thinking about, fair trade learning and a lot of the work that we've done as a collaborative has very specific values to it, or community generated values that have emerged over time. So it's not necessarily about a values orientation or lack thereof, but it's sort of that bridge to, well, how do you move from, we have these really deeply felt values, to how do they appear in all of these different vectors of the work that we do, right? So in terms of like building that bridge, I think about, we'll talk in a moment about some examples, but there are folks who have taken those values and moved them into a space of actually operationalizing them. And I think as we talk more about DEA, we can think through how does that serve as a bridge. All right. Does anybody else want to share assessment context, things that they're kind of noodling on right now in their institutions or their different organizations?
I just note that Nora mentions the distinction between formative and summative as different types of assessment with different types of purposes that might yield different types of inclusion or exclusion as we do them. I think formative, ongoing, sustained assessment can be far more inclusive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
provides more opportunities to even ask some of those difficult questions, right?
That's right.
All right.
And I saw something in Tiffany's that I think spoke a little bit to something that I was thinking about. Tiffany, if I'm reading you correctly, the sort of starting out with a culture or a context or a framing
Mm-hmm.
that establishes this is what we do here. This is how we work.
Mm-hmm.
I often use the phrase from Covey about begin as you wish to continue.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, sometimes folks will push back on the democratic engagement work and say that, well, you can't really start that way. You need to start technocratic. You need to start hierarchical because that's the way the world is. That's how we know how to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree that's true. That's the way the world is. But I find a lot of power in that quote from Covey of begin as you wish to continue. And so your idea there of the framing from the beginning, I think is key.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right. Is there anything anybody else wanted to share before we prompt you with another question?
One quick piece on that. I mean, I do think if you are starting with more voices at the table in the framing, I think that the way that you define success can change subtly but importantly. And so, you know, from there, all other things flow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we were having a discussion before this, prepping for today, talking about social constructs and the amount of things that people take for granted as they just are, or that is the way the world is. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we go, but where can we push on that? And where can we nudge it as we go? All right. I'll artfully reshare the screen really quickly because we do have another prompt for you. All right, Patti, did you want to navigate this one?
Sure. So again, we're back in our Google Doc here, column F, I think it is, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And Sarah alluded to this earlier. So whether our values and principles, whether we refer to them as fair trade, whether we refer to them as democratic, whatever the framing is, I think we often want to be sure that we're walking that talk, right? They're supposed to be actionable. They're supposed to be operationalized.
Mm-hmm.
That's been a big part of the work on democratic engagement over the last decade is what would it mean to walk that talk on Tuesday in class or when I pick up the telephone to call someone or on and on and on. And that commitment, though, is different than evidence that I'm actually doing it. And so that's sort of the assessment lens on this question. How do we know that we are walking our talk? In the case of community-based global learning, how do we know that the partnership is ethical, that it is equitable, that on Tuesday we are living out, we are living and breathing fair tradeness in our conversations, in our documents, in our relationships? So in column F, just a few thoughts there. How do or how would, how would we know? What would constitute evidence, affirmation, accurate affirmation?
Yeah. All right. Take a moment to get out of there.
Do we? So I'm thinking about how I'd love to like operate, which is different from do. Is that all right?
It's totally fine.
Yeah. You can say both things if you wish in the column.
There you go. Yeah. We wanted to make sure that folks were thinking about like, what is the evidence that actually shows it versus trying to explain one's own partnership or the partnership itself or the program. It's like, no. What is the evidence? What are the ways and how is that, whether it's measurable or not, how do you know?
I just did a flashback to a conversation when I was on the campus. This must have been 15 years ago now, when there was a push with various programs and centers to, what are you doing with assessment, et cetera. And a woman sitting in front of me across my desk and said something like, what everybody's telling me is what their goals are. That's not what I'm talking about. Sometimes they tell me, what are they doing? That's not what I'm talking about. how do you know that what you're doing advances your goals or enacts your values? And so she's sort of trotting around campus making that distinction. Not enough tell me what you want. It's not enough tell me what you're doing.
Right.
It's enough to, we need to push ourselves to, how do we know?
Yeah.
Wait, Patti, you just really, I think, productively challenged me there, but might not be smart enough to keep up. I was about to write about how I would, what did you say? What's the distinction?
She made the distinction between, she's going around to these offices. How are you assessing stuff? And people are telling her, well, here's what my goals are. Here's our mission. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. She says, no, it's not what I'm asking. And then they tell her, well, here's what we do. Here's our activities. This is how that's how we assess. We report what we're doing. She said, no. I'm after, how do you know that what you're doing is in line with what you say you're trying to do?
Good.
Enacts your values, moves towards your goals, is in the service of the kinds of relationships you want. That's how we would talk about it today. I just flashed back to that more.
Yeah.
That tendency that we have to, when we're asked, how do we know what we report what we do?
Yeah.
And do these activities. That's. Uh-oh, Maureen.
Maureen has emptied her cell in the Excel spreadsheet. No.
Maureen, say more if you want to.
Yeah, please. Maureen's here to learn. Right. It makes me think of the active citizen continuum. You know, when we're working with students, they like to say, well, I know about this thing, therefore I'm a good active citizen. Or, you know, I did this report on X and that's how I know, or I'm knowledgeable about. But rather like that final column, when you look through, I don't know, most of you are probably familiar with this, that from the breakaway organization, it's a spectrum and it goes from sort of like the completely oblivious to worlds mechanisms and everything kind of to the very end, which is the active citizen continuum, little c citizen. And you get to that final kind of category where it's community and the things that you care about are part of all of your decision making, right? So how you vote, how you shop, how do you interact with folks on a day-to-day basis, like that's the difference here. And that's what I feel like Patti's helping us to think through, right? That walking the talk.
Seeing several things in the responses, and I'm seeing a lot of power sharing, right? Emphasized in different ways. Nora emphasizes language and improved understanding. Eric more on agreement and evidence and shared work. And Tiffany, I see you saying something similar as well, the shared decision making, right? And some measure of reciprocity.
And Joe, I like how you're hitting on the process and product, right? You know, think about critical reflection. You can see the different mechanisms just as much as you could tally something at the end for a report. It's really about appreciating both of those pieces.
Yeah, I think it's also not just about agreement. I think multiple perspectives are going to bring disagreement and conflict and contradiction, and it's how we hold those in tension and work through them that is fundamental to some of our thinking around assessment in the big white paper, but it's also elemental to kind of inclusive, diverse, equitable work relationships.
And I think I read Eric's comment completely different. Eric, are you talking about an agreement as like a policy agreement or agreement in terms of consensus?
Well, we just dropped that in the last minute, but I was really interested to hear more about Joe's thinking about relational tension as a productive part of like process. But in that thing, I think I was imagining, I always would have preferred, and I'm trying to make the things work forward, that when we start into a community-engaged, community-based learning partnership, that we go through the process with partners and they say,
Mhm.
and I'll think about some things we're working on here or have been working on, you know, what we really want to see is the creation of a new archive around this particular question. Or we really want to see students helping us produce these materials. I want to know what that output thing is, that kind of agreement. And often it's not so definitively material, though I think often with off-campus partners, there are things like that. And I think it would help us all to name those things a little bit more about in these processes. But then, yeah, so sorry, I'm getting beyond your question. So the agreement would be about like, this is what we're doing together, just at a core level. And then we'd have to get farther down the road into like, therefore this means we want to see this in terms of student development, and we want to see this in terms of community outputs or.
Eric, if I could build on that just real quickly, you just, as you were talking, something came to my mind. You said naming it. And Joe and Sarah hadn't thought about this when we posed this question, but all of the conversation that a lot of us are having in this work about language and about how it's too easy to use terms sloppily. And so I think part of how I would know if I'm walking my talk is I need to be precise about what my talk is. Right. And I think sometimes we can hide behind, well, you know, transformational, well, you know, reciprocal, equitable, ethical.
Yep.
Good sounding words. But if I don't know, if we as a group, as a team, as a partnership, don't really know what we mean by our talk, then not only can we not walk it well, but we then don't know if we're walking it well. And that could be sometimes thinking that could be almost an intentional. Don't push for naming, Eric. Don't push for that kind of precision, because with that would come a higher level of accountability or something. And so it strikes me that that's part of this framing from the beginning, Tiffany, and we'll talk about, again, DEA and co-creating what the values are and all of that. Seems to be it's co-creating in a way that ensures that we've asked those hard questions about what do these values mean? What do these principles mean?
Right. Yeah. The precision question, especially, Patti, you're getting my mind going, because we had a Knowledge Mobilization Committee meeting earlier today, and some of the folks who are on the call now were on that as well. And we have a colleague who is thinking about orphanage tourism, and like on its face, we know that that is not ethical, it's not helpful, this is not something we want people to be dropping in. And then there's also a question about kind of community voice and contextual cultural aspects, and who has the empowerment to ask questions and to ask people to come in and support in different ways. So if we can't get past that, like we don't have the same shared operating definitions, it's not super like neon bright that this is a no. How are we okay engaging in the nuance then to make good ethical decisions about the other opportunities to work with those organizations? So some people might hear it off the bat and say, oh, you're an orphanage? No, we're not going to work with you, period. We're not going to help you. That's not what we're asking. We're asking to be able to have those hard discussions about what are the pieces, what are the, you know, the spectrum areas in between, and how can we be most effective and work towards that, you know, space where there aren't orphanages anymore, or there aren't, disempowering power balances that hurt communities, and that everybody has the material needs that they need. So anyway, but the point being is to get to that space to even have those questions. I think a lot of us are using these big themes or buzzwords to cover the larger, right? So. All right. Does anybody have anything else they wanted to kind of say before we moved on to the next couple of slides? No. All right. Thank you all so much. This is a really robust conversation, and I want to keep us moving along a little bit. All right. So All right, so for today's discussion, we really did want to put democratically engaged assessment, which is this inclusive, values-engaged framework that's the focus of the work that we've been doing over these years, in explicit dialogue and connection to the work of the collaborative, to the work of fair trade learning, and those principles of ethical, community-based global learning. So for many of us, our work is one of holding these tensions between expectations and aims of our institutions, the responsibilities to our partners, to our students, to ourselves, and the ongoing power dynamics of this, the cross-cultural work that we so often do. So some of the things that we've all engaged with is kind of challenging: what is expertise? What is knowledge? Who is the teacher? Who is the educator in our partnerships? What assumptions do we hold about power dynamics, and who holds power in the community-based global learning partnerships? How, right? How do we know this work? How do we understand evidence of this work towards more just, equitable, and sustainable frames? And so we want to focus the conversation on, how we understand partnerships, how we understand relationships, how we understand the work, the operational pieces, and then the teaching, learning, and pedagogical implications as well. So if we got all these wonderful ethical standards and these things that are driving us, how do we know that we're aligning with them? And I'll just briefly mention a couple of opportunities and examples from the work that you all might be familiar with. Gap Year Association, I mentioned earlier, they have worked to apply the fair trade learning rubric to the accreditation of the partners that they would recommend students to be working with during those gap years. So they took that extra step and they walked across that bridge to say, these are the ways in which we are hoping that our partner organizations, these are the standards they must meet in order for them to be accredited by us. And so that was a space of them taking assessment and taking critical reflection and moving values into operation. In our Knowledge Mobilization Committee, we've got a community of practice who is focused on relational work. How do you relationship build, and what does that then mean for the health of our partnerships and our programs? Most of us have been working with the Sustainable Development Goals in some respect, as per the United Nations. How are the values of shared visioning towards addressing these SDGs showing up in our work? And how does that change or not change our students for the long term? And then finally, an example that was mentioned earlier too is this Global Interdependence Toolkit. People within this network worked together to reimagine what curriculum looked like, how during the pandemic, during a lot of constraints, could we work together to create alternate pathways for education when so many people are disenfranchised digitally in terms of access, the stressors that are happening within the world. So there are a lot of these different spaces where we've had the opportunity to think differently and to recreate. And hopefully in the discussion today, we'll be thinking through like, okay, how do we name those things a little bit more intentionally and make that bridge to walk across? All right, and so I'm going to pass that over to Joe.
Yeah, so despite our best intentions in doing inclusive assessment, those often with whom we work don't share those same commitments, and those colleagues may have significant power to alter our assessment and lead us into shutdown. Many Imagining America members, and indeed the genesis of our work together has been really about Imagining America members sharing these stories. They've had difficult experiences conducting assessment on service learning and community engagement, from uncertainty about what and how to measure learning or community outcomes to commonly these difficulties implementing a more collaborative and participatory model of assessment. As one example, a member of our research group, Sylvia Gale, whom many of you may know, Executive Director of the Bonner Center for Civic Engagement at the University of Richmond, Go Spiders, tells a story of a meeting with a campus assessment specialist. In the meeting about assessing learning outcomes for students in service learning courses, Sylvia was advocating for a method in which faculty would come together and share their learning goals for students, along with artifacts of student work, so that they could reach conclusions about what service learning had enabled their students to learn. In response to that proposal, the specialist dismissed the idea and urged her to stick to the university protocols of identifying indicators of high impact and merely surveying faculty, saying, what you see here, don't ask them what to measure, tell them. Not only did this method focus on course design principles, possible misleading proxy measure for what students actually learned. But it favored efficiency and quantifiability over a deeper, more qualitative and collaborative assessment. Unsure of her own expertise and position, she felt shut down and wanting assessment to not just be a means, a mere technique, but instead an end in itself, a way to build community expertise about values and processes of teaching and learning. As we will see, this is not a solitary or unique experience, and it was stories like this, again, that motivated us to do this work. So, as we've contemplated the obstacles to assessment that lives up to our values of collaboration and co-creation, full participation, among others, it's been easy to discuss academic and social systems that are technocratic, bureaucratic, neoliberal, favoring assessment that's top-down, that's efficient, certification after the fact, that's aimed at marketing this or that aspect of programs that we work in. To be sure, those systems tend to exclude those who are not assessment experts or technicians, not to mention those who relish deep reflection and productive dialogue, regardless of its inefficiencies. Yet, we feel the need to go further than this by asking the question you see here. How are these exclusive forms of assessment informed and exacerbated by cultures of race, class, gender, sexuality, nation, ability, and others? To put it in other words, how are these inequalities reproduced rather than resisted in our assessment work and the systems that govern it? For instance, whose voices do we disproportionately privilege as experts or disregard as lay knowledge? And how does that distinction police and protect privilege of who gets to do the work of assessment? What discourses of race or gender, just to take two examples, construct biases that legitimize narrow forms of expert knowledge and bureaucratic procedure? How do experts marginalize entire groups from assessment work because of their different ways of knowing, bolstering epistemic exclusions and leading to that benign neglect that ultimately can create the structural violence that is at the core of so many injustices? There's so many more questions to ask, but I think we could also ask alternatively, what diverse local, indigenous, and community-based knowledge systems are vital to the kind of critical reflection assessment should make possible, an assessment that can help to understand and transform our institutions and practices that create social justice and equality. And how can we celebrate diversity and these subaltern ways of knowing and build solidarity across differences to let their voices speak in assessment work? So I guess we wanted to pose the question to you in some sense, is how do you feel the shutdown when you attempt to resist these traditional ways of assessment that might be more narrow in focus and may impose certain power on others? Can we think about ways that we might understand the shutdown through identity lenses as we think about who gets shut down, when and why? What are some of the dynamics that are there in the way that you experience community-based global learning and how we assess it? This is really meant to be not just a rhetorical question. Feel free to respond to me, actually.
Nor is it a Google Docs question. So
no, it's not.
if folks want
this is extra.
This is extra. Bonus questions.
Yeah.
I want to say a broader reflection out loud, just to a small group here today, and
right, cone of silence.
And so we're just so glad to have you. And I think Nora and I need to switch our hats and get out of a host role and just dive in with this special opportunity. There's like 8 of us here. And so I'm going to dive in and really appreciate you all taking your time. And with apologies for my characteristic meta thinking on your question, it goes back to what Patti and I were in the chat about. I've just been kind of obsessing on the way in which in community-based global learning, we tend to think about, or historically, and this may be changing, maybe it's all changed in the last 2 years, and this is dated, but historically, so many of the concerns about practice are placed away from campuses. The campus gets privileged, right? And actually, so there's a lot of conversation going on in North Carolina. Dia Abdo, who I'm a fan of, is at Guilford, or well, was at Guilford. I'm not sure if she is anymore. But points out the college and university campuses that the locus of international presence and futures accountable to Indigenous past, right? I think like even our very infrastructure, we think about community impact in a way that accepts or removes. And I think this is deeply rooted in that like decades and decades of imagining that academics can be like somehow objective and separate. And so the infrastructure that we live on is allowed to be separate, right? And so, you know, public purposes, we go off campus. We forget to think about our structures are built on exclusion and resource accumulation at their core, and kind of exempt them from the analysis. So that's where my obsession has been recently.
Thank you, Eric. That gets me thinking about the ways that the academy, especially in the last 30 or 40 years, has become ever more focused on professionalization, specialization, and kind of insular discussions within its own research communities. And it's often those on the kind of in the staff and student affairs and kind of the margins of the primary work of the campus, right, that are pushing our faculty to think about public scholarship and beyond just publicity, right, but actually public scholarship with and for community partners. And yeah, I think that speaks to kind of the bureaucratic elements of professionalization, but also our kind of market-oriented culture within the academy, right? And how we too often focus our students and our own academic development on what's most expedient for growing endowments and growing attention and publicity, and not really on social betterment, right? And all of its sometimes difficult ways to see, right? Some things that are not easily seen by the academy. So I'm seeing more things come up in the chat, however. Patty's giving us references. Thank you, Patti. Do you want to say more about those?
Sarah, you're familiar with them. And
yeah, David Fine wrote in one of our special issues with the Michigan Journal a few years ago, and we can, while we're chatting, I'll find the link. Thinking about critical consciousness, university, and global citizenship specifically, and trying to unpack how are we teaching students to be critical of the institution that we are then employed by as well, and thinking about pathways to continue to do that good work even when we're constrained by like neoliberal expectations. And so I think part of it falls into critical university studies, part of it falls into, I think you might have taken a feminist critique lens as well, but I'll look that up and I'll share it as we go.
I wanted to say as well, I really valued the book for holding on to the tensions and paradoxes of being inside the system or being corrupted by, you know, while you're trying to change it, and how you exist between. Going back to that larger question you asked earlier of like where we find resistance, like there's no accountability to assessing from anyone else's perspective, but our own and our students. And there's no, I can't find grant funding that allows me to share that funding with others, so that I'm, you know, like it just, all of it is kind of, it feels like belly button staring at student outcomes for the end of the semester on the backs of other projects. And as I study the projects and we assess the value of this kind of teaching, I see a lot of, I've been looking at also that long-term work that students, alumni find the experience valuable, but tracking whether those projects yielded value, ooh, I wish I could see more there, and more longitudinally and more from others' perspectives. And I feel like I'm seeing the opposite. Even when I'm talking to students and faculty, I see them going, well, I'm not sure it did because we only had 3 months. And then I went on to do other things and I had to drop it, right? So I'm really worried and interested in, I don't know how we get by. There's nobody wanting that, it seems to me, at an administrative level, at a grant level, or there's very few. I don't know. wanting to make sure that we shift the power dynamics, that we shift the funding, that we assess from more inclusive lenses, that we co-design our courses. I don't see, I'm seeing faculty activism that like, we want to do it. Like we're doing it with no funding. We're doing it over the summer. Like, but I want to see the administrative buy-in, I guess. I don't know. And then I'm also disheartened because I mean, with the question of race and just diverse representation of just being overrepresented in every room I'm in, and being tired of my own voice and being reflected at me and wanting other voices in those spaces or wondering about the spaces I'm in. So then I go back to the book you mentioned, A Third University is Possible, where you latch on to moments of hope.
Yeah. I realized, you know, I dropped my response to that big question in there, and that response had to do with the ways in which the university itself is kind of exempted through power structures that are traditional. I also wanted to convict myself of having drawn our focus back to the university and credit Nora for being the voice in the back of my head without saying anything. It's like, you've just pulled the focus back to the university. Because that's, of course, the other dynamic here. I mean, I want to work for this university or this college that is super conscious of community-driven desires. That's why I'm spending so much time in the university, but it becomes its own vicious cycle, right? And quiets other really important desires, or muffles, I should say better.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm conscious of our time. So do we want to move into some of the explanation of the framework? But I love this conversation. I feel like we could keep going for, for a very long time.
I'll just note that in those of you who have not read every word of the big white paper that we wrote, and trust me, I'm offended if you haven't, that there is a section in the latter parts that Patti and I spent a lot of time deliberating over about how to navigate power structures in community partnerships and the academy generally, as we think about the shutdown, right? What are our potential responses? To yield to it, to resist it, or to hold tension with administrators? Sometimes we go through different scenarios in which we argue some are better than others, right? Ultimately hopeful that holding tension is going to be more creative, more productive for us and the work that we're trying to do around, you know, democratization and social justice, but also for our administrators in the way that they want to pursue more rigor and more criticality in the work that they do, if they will just allow some space for the type of assessment processes that we're discussing. So I urge you to go check that out. Hopefully some of the words will resonate. Not all of them will solve your problems. I wish we could have done that. But I think what we're getting at is ultimately something that we were wanting to talk about in the DEA work, which is really how do we encounter the world very differently from the one we envision, and how do we navigate that? So let me say, and what motivated us to explore and develop and refine the DEA framework is really our desire to try to bridge that gap between kind of managerial impositions and expert-driven processes and perfunctory afterthoughts around assessment that can be really exclusive, and assessment that we think can be and should be more transformative and involve all stakeholders and value-engaged exploration of processes, relationships, results of their work together. We argue that DEA offers a way to view assessment not merely measuring and documenting and reporting, but also a way to kind of explore shared realities and co-create new possibilities. In short, we're compelled by the question, how might assessment be an empowering process that enables us to create our path forward together, help us walk the talk, as Patti has said, of our highest values, and now allow us to share the story of our work in ways that are not only accurate, but authentic. We hope that assessment imagined in that way can become democratic practice, enacted in the context of democratic engagement that, again, Patti has highlighted, and in the service of building more shared inquiry and justice. So I want to say also, while we've been working on DEA for some time and published our white paper 2018, we hope that we can revisit our work in the wake of the many social crises that we currently face to help all of our colleagues doing service learning and community engagement and public scholarship more generally reflect on the outcomes of their work and to make it more effective. And we do that not as opportunists seeking to use a crisis. We're not disaster capitalists trying to, work through DEA as some kind of solution, but merely to help us and many communities with whom we partner and reimagine our work in ways that can bring about social changes we need. So indeed, the pandemic, along with all the overlapping crises we've experienced in the last years around authoritarianism and exclusion, offers us opportunity to reflect on our practices. And we take inspiration from Arundhati Roy's quote last year that she wrote at the beginning of the pandemic. If you haven't read it, we'll flash it now and give everyone a chance to read it. If you get weepy, you need a little moment, it's okay. She's a pretty powerful writer. And I guess as I think about this, if we're going to walk through this portal lightly and drop the heavy baggage, we need to be able to critically reflect upon and indeed assess how we have contributed to social inequalities and injustices. In community-based global learning, we have to ask how we are living our values, honoring our partnerships, and providing the type of deep and responsible learning opportunities we've been describing. And how do we know? How do we ensure that the work we're doing is in the service of that equitable and just future? So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Sarah.
Yeah, of course. So we've been thinking a lot about this balance, right? So oftentimes in our assessment, we get pushed because of the wanting to show the results, right? Show the end product, show the picture that we can put on the front of the university website, show the amount of revenue that we're generating from international partnerships. I'm over exaggerating, but to make a point that oftentimes we are pushed by those results. But if you think about the results process relationship triangle that's offered by the Interaction Institute, like these dimensions of success are contingent upon the other pieces of the triangle, right? You can't ignore one to compromise in order to get to just the results. It's naive to think that you can work in that respect. So when we've been thinking about how to understand these complex relationships, we wanted to make sure that we were designing ongoing iterative processes. We were valuing the process as much as the product, that we could include multiple perspectives, that we could be open to many types of evidence. This demands that we have this shared inquiry that deepens our understandings, our relationships, that keeps this triangle healthy and not askew, right? And move beyond outcomes, move beyond the pictures, the reports, the summative versus the formative and summative coming together. And inspired by ongoing dialogues with colleagues from around not just IA, but in our own communities and our own institutions across partnerships that we've been working with for years, we've heard a lot about kind of the evolution of how people are thinking about assessment, or how they hold some of these assumptions within the assessment paradigm. So, looking across this spectrum, there are folks who really do believe that assessment is just this value-free, there's no imposed values, it's completely objective, quantitative exercise that will prove something. Some think that, assessment can be value neutral. It doesn't take sides. It's this thing that exists kind of in a bubble unto itself. We're moving in this farther direction of not just value laden, where, assessment can be rooted in values, derived from a particular set of values, but very, very specified, or one piece of the process is value connected, to a real values engaged paradigm. So it's grounded in values, it's informed by values, it's in dialogue with values, And beyond this, like at some point we talked about values. Values are really imbued in the entirety of the process. And I believe now I'm passing it over to Patti.
And so just quickly here, we just want to hit a couple of the highlights of DEA. And I'm aware what Nora, hey, Mika has read the white paper.
She has.
So she should give us an
page of it.
An update. Eric and Nora, I expect you were familiar with bits and pieces of it as it was emerging, so we don't want to hit too hard on things that you're already thinking about. But so yes, we wrote this white paper, and the link has been in the chat there. Slides there. That white paper was the product of, as we've alluded to, many conversations over many years, conversations internally, conversations at conferences, et cetera. Went through a couple of different framings of the name of the it, and for the purpose of the white paper, and now democratically engaged assessment. Basically, as Sarah was just saying, grounded in, informed by, and in dialogue with the values and commitments of democratic engagement, which are, by definition, contested values and commitments. Next slide. The democratic engagement white paper was, of course, the main place that I have been historically inside, trying to get my mind around what are those commitments and values. These six we particularly draw on. With rather than in or to or on or for, asset-based orientation, co-creation of everything. Potentially transformative is what we're after, rather than sort of settling for transactional exchanges. Everyone is co-educating, co-learning, co-generating knowledge practice, and with means and ends, purposes and processes aligned around inclusive deliberative democracy. As I mentioned earlier, then part of what I think a lot of us have been involved in, as that white paper, at least I think, called some important questions or shown some light on some pervasive tensions in our work, is this question of walking the talk. Well, how would you do that on Tuesday? And so part of that is getting, we think, more precise about what the values are that that we want to walk in our assessment practice. And so these are the six, not intended to be comprehensive, not intended to be exclusive, but that seem to be at the heart of democratically engaged assessment. Full participation and co-creation, probably particularly salient to the focus today on inclusivity and exclusivity, but also practicability. It has to work in the world, and that doesn't mean compromise, and that doesn't mean settling, but it does mean not only holding these values in tension, but continuing to hold them until we find a way that we can actually accomplish, be, and do what it is that we wanted to do and be. Reclaiming rigor away from a sort of quantitative only neoliberal positivist sort of understanding. It's generative, it's resilient. And so, next slide, Sarah, thank you. When we want to operationalize those values, this is sort of the crux of it. So we talked to people, we looked at other work, we looked at ourselves, we went back and forth on, so how do you know if you're doing that? And how can you help yourself do that better as an individual engaged in assessment or inquiry? How can we as a community? And so one of the responses to that was, let's develop a set of questions that would call our attention to the presence, the absence, the depth of these values. And so for each of the six values, this is excerpted, we're playing with very specific questions that you can pose to any tool. And so here's just the example with co-creation. If I really want to walk that value in using a tool, in selecting a tool, in modifying a tool, a method, an approach, don't put too much weight on tool per se. These are some of the things that I need to be self-critical about. And if too many of my answers to these questions are no, or one person, or in contradiction to my value of co-creation, then I either use a different tool, or I change this one, or I bring some people together to create another one. But anyway, so questions like that associated with each of these 6 values to pose to any particular approach or tool is, we think, part of walking the talk, operationalizing the values.
Yeah, and likewise, we wanted to make sure that every phase of assessment was interrogated with similar questions around all the 6 values, or more, that might enter into, you know, your own kind of discussions of what assessment should be for all the stakeholders. So whether we're defining goals and audiences for assessment, designing methods, implementing them, communicating results, or considering next steps, we need to be asking ourselves these kinds of critical questions here in red, around why we're doing what we're doing, whether we're living into our values. For instance, if defining values, goals, and audiences, we probably need to regard full participation to be a value we wish to uphold, then consequently, we're going to need to consider how to maximize the diversity of voices who can access and participate in the assessment process at every level, right, and at every step. So in the white paper, you can see much more of our developed discussion on the questions you might pose at each step for each value. Similarly, we also want to hold in mind the values that orient and motivate us to determine what methods we might use and how they might be implemented. In the white paper, we spend time in a rather lengthy appendix, again, too lengthy, showing how one might analyze various example methods. One example method for each of the 5 foci of assessment that we might choose, right?
Mm-hmm.
Community outcomes, partnerships, higher ed, institutions, faculty development, student learning.
Mm-hmm.
We chose those example tools that you see listed here, not because they are the best or the brightest or somehow best live into the values, but they were ones that seemed to, given the experiences of a lot of our colleagues in Imagining America, come up often as
Mm-hmm.
ones that might be helpful. And so we took them to task. We subjected them to a lot of interrogation and questioning. And in the appendix, you can see that we see how some of them are maybe deficient in some values and really robust in helping us to realize others.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say, however, spoiler alert, we find that most any method could be used in a way that lives into those values, right? Even the most quantitative, perfunctory sounding kind of survey method could be done in a way that's more or less co-creative, generative, rigorous, or et cetera, right?
Mm-hmm.
And conversely, we could use some of these methods in ways that are completely none of those things. So much depends on implementation.
Right.
And to give you a clearer sense of that, we thought Patti could say a little bit about the trees tool that we survey.
And I'll just say on that last point you made there, Joe, I had a real wake-up call probably 12 years ago when somebody told me basically, well, service learning can be done in technocratic ways. I was like, oh, whoa, okay. Yeah, yes, thank you for telling me that. And so now I tend to think about or talk about service learning as democratic engagement.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because given the pervasiveness of technocratic, bureaucratic, neoliberal, et cetera, paradigms, yeah, in anything, even if it's conceptualized as coming from a commitment to these democratic values, it is not that by definition. It is not that without effort and without constant critical review. And so trees 2, we just published, we meaning Bob Bringle and myself and Lori Niffen and a handful of doctoral students, Jasmina Camo, Michigan, just published about a 10-year story of the development of a particular approach, trees, to assessing partnership quality. And one of the contributions to our telling that story and to continuing to refine trees was this very critical look that the DEA work that the APPS team took. Given that we want to assess partnership quality, here's a way that's been out there to try to do it. And in a few ways, it walks the talk of some of these values, and in a whole lot of ways, it doesn't, and it didn't. And so that supported and guided us, the team who were continuing to refine trees, not only in the need to keep doing that, but in the directions for doing that. And so, as I was saying, for example, this article that just came out in the Irish Science Journal, I think it's co-authored by 10 of us, and that included 5 or 6 doc students who had used it in their dissertation research, some of whom had shared in their own research community partner critique of the tool, right? So baby steps in the direction of being more full participation, more co-creation, given that in this case, the tool existed, and that's often will be the case. The tool is there. Now, how do we be as DE as we can in our relationship with it and our modifications to it and our uses of it? So that's an ongoing process, and for me at least has been a nice example, a nice process example of how I would want to look at and continue pushing really any part of my work within assessment, but also more generally by bringing this lens of how can the thing better walk the talk of the values that we purport to enact.
Just a quick thing to add on to that, Patti. I think it also speaks to the way in which we approach this work, and we discussed it, and we had so many debates and thoughts about how to, because we didn't want to prescribe and we didn't want people to think of this as a one and done framework or something that was written in stone or concrete, but rather that it was this iterative, generative process that would be constantly kind of reflected upon and reevaluated. And I think that that's hard for some people. They really, sometimes the neoliberal practicability of the institution demands an answer, a finishing point. And I don't think that we're not comfortable prescribing that to anyone. So I hope that folks are hearing this in a way that's very inclusive, co-created, and continuing too.
Yeah. So with that, we wanted to, and I'm sorry so many people had to leave us at the top of the hour, and I realize we're almost done, but I did want to open this to any discussions of how we can nurture and norm inclusive assessment practices, or any questions that you might have generally about DEI.
I'm curious, I know we don't have very much time, but if there's any, like, what are y'all working on right now? Like, I'm curious, this paper is awesome. I think it's, even though it's been there for a few years, it's still so useful and provides so many great questions and resources. And I think of like the questions as like a tool for reflection and critique, right? But I'm curious, like, if there's other things in the works, if there's what the group's working on, if there's any kind of, I don't know.
Take it away, Sarah.
Oh, so we got some funding from Bringing Theory to Practice, and right now we're about to kick off a phase of fellows who are working with us, who are coming from community organizations, higher ed institutions. Janice McMillan, who you all know from the collaborative as well, will be with us. And hopefully, we're co-creating that. So we're not structuring it too awful much right now. But the idea is that folks are going to be generating, context-specific briefs, examples, vignettes, focus areas, blog posts, et cetera, that we're going to be working together to kind of vision some interesting projects moving forward, and maybe a shortened version of the white paper that's more accessible and easily shareable.
There's so much there though, too. It's hard to how do you pull things out? That's too much. Cool.
Yeah. Cool. Friends, what am I missing?
The community of practice.
Go for it, Patti.
So Nora, also we are working with an ever-expanding group of folks that we'd love to chat with the two of you about, who have really engaged with this, the quote from Roy, for example, and Sarah, there's another one if you want to put it up, this idea about not going back to normal. Normal wasn't worth going back to for way too many. And specifically looking at partnership, not exclusively, but specifically looking at partnerships in terms of the pandemic as portal, more generally in terms of, sort of all of 2020, the pandemic, the racial violence, the economic injustice, the climate change, the on and on, that we don't want to default back to what we were before our attention was caught up in all of these things. And in many ways, our ways of being together changed. We want to use this sort of liminality of this space to move forward in transformative ways. And DEA comes into that by really being the grounding of that process. So we are envisioning a community, an international community of practice that will have hubs all over the world, hopefully, in which people are looking at, with this sort of refresh lens, at partnerships and doing it as a demonstration project of democratically engaged assessment. So in the preliminary co-creation of the vision, we keep asking ourselves, how do we make this more inclusive? How do we make this more co-creative? How do we ensure that this is generative? And some very specific ways that we want to do that, like who all will have access to spaces to share their stories, and the sharing of stories as data. So I think that I have seen that the collaborative has done some thinking about sort of moving forward out of this moment. And so again, yeah, we'd like to connect and talk with you about that. But I think that if we can, we've been talking about what we're calling found pilots, like when we found folks doing DEA-ish work already, gathering those, assembling those, learning from those. I think this will be one of our first, maybe our first really semi-large scale effort to design from the get-go a community asking questions about its work and how to deepen and transform that work in a very self-consciously DEA way, and then watching that as we go.
That sounds really exciting.
Yeah, it's all very exciting. And again, thank you for your time today. I was curious, I loved your opening, and, we're forced to put one word down, and I put agnostic, and I've been reflecting on, like, why is that? And I thought your chart captured that pretty well, for different reasons related to, like, the different ways in which it's used, and some of them are not sort of aligned with the direction of the values of democratically engaged assessment. But the other thing I think, and I'm not sure if this was already part of what's been presented and I just missed it, but what's your sense of what assessment has to do with change? And I want to ask that from a space of, I think some of my agnosticism comes from sort of, yeah, and so even as I'm reflecting out loud as I ask the question, I'm sure that in many ways my doctoral training would have led me to believe that if you demonstrate something well, then systems will change as a result. And we know that's not true, right? So I'm not sure. I think it seemed intuitively to me that the more democratic assessment is, the more likely it's aligned with how change actually works. But as we think about pandemic as a portal, I'm really interested in social change, and I'm curious how your working's drawing those connections together.
That's a good question. My first thoughts, not necessarily my last, or ones that should be for everyone, is it's, yes, you're right. Assessment is simply a process of critical reflection. It helps various stakeholders understand what they're doing together so that they can improve it. And so if we're thinking of courses or projects or programs, yes, the informational content will be greater, and maybe there will be realizations in that can help everyone to rebuild those programs to meet everyone's needs more optimally. But I think it also helps to, as we hope for our students when they go through service learning courses, right? They see the real world and its complexities and the power relationships that are a part of it. They understand the structural inequalities and injustices that exist in lived everyday forms. And so I think when we have assessment that enables multiple voices to come together, they can better reflect together on what those social structures are and what the lever points might be for any kind of change that's necessary. It doesn't mean that they'll always be able to act on it easily, right? And that there's some kind of DEA or any form of assessment is not going to find the key to every lock for social change. But I think it can, you're right. Ultimately, I agree that I think more democratic processes allow for more multiple perspectives, greater problem solving, and ultimately greater opportunities for social change. I think we see that in social movement literature as well, throughout a variety of different contexts. So that's another paper that Patti and I are thinking about.
There you go.
So.
It's also, I think that part of the full participation and co-creation question and values that we've really centered in here, the more voices, not just the more voices at the table, but the more intentional space making for people to be agents of change, to be empowered, to find their own agency in these spaces than where they haven't before, right? If we're appreciating more multiple ways of knowing, if we're creating more avenues for people to advocate for things that their communities need, want, prioritize, you know, I know making space isn't enough, but I do think that that intentional creation of space does start to push the envelope. And I also think one of the things that we struggled with is, what if people have a fully DEA way of approaching their assessment, but their values are really awful, right? What if they operationalize all of these great processes, but to an aim or to an end that's not positive? And, you know, you have to open yourself up to the fact that that's a possibility. And so what gets twinned alongside of this? Like, is it fair trade learning? Is it social change modeling and where people have spheres of influence? Like it's something that stands on its own in terms of the potential for transforming assessment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that change will automatically come if you're not planning for it either.
I appreciate this question, and I think it should lead us to write 2 paragraphs on the underlying theory of change that DEA is assuming. I think condense that and let's make that piece of paper. The 2 things that were coming to my mind, first is that visual with the world as it is and the world as we envision it. I think that for Parker Palmer and people engaged in transformative leadership and those kinds of, let me just stop there. That is part of the theory of change, is that change comes from tension holding that is generative of new possibilities. And DEA, democratically engaged anything, I think, given a technocratic, neoliberal, bureaucratic default and paradigm, calls us to look for and to produce those generative third things, those new possibilities that don't exist until and unless and while you hold things in tension. So I think that's part of it. Second thing I was thinking, and Sarah, this might be inside what you were saying, is I think for me, DEA is an arena of enacting DE, right? And so democratically engaged anything, and that's another project, right? DEA is 1 chapter in a book that has 100 chapters on democratically engaged stuff, right? Democratically engaged anything, I think, pushes back on forces that are power over, pushes back on silencing norms, cultivates agency. And so in that sense, it's not only the assessment part, I think, Eric, where the weight of change is, it's the democratically engaged part. So a democratically engaged workshop is going to help nudge the world towards social justice because it is designed to nurture voice, to push back on defaults, to have Nora have that 1 minute of thinking something and saying it, and then Sarah responded to it, and then Joe built on it, and damn, Nora has some power that she wouldn't have experienced without that, or she might not have experienced without that design, right? And Nora having that moment of power then she carries that over into her staff meeting with you, and on and on and on and on, right? So I think I really like the question. I think we need to articulate a theory of change. And I think I'm seeing it on both parts of the phrase. What does assessment have to do with change? But then what does democratically engaged anything have to do with change? And maybe the third part is the Parker part. What does tension holding have to do with change? Whether that's, because that's not necessarily assessment. It's not necessarily DCE, right? So
Well,
thank you.
I love that question too. It's making me think, when I read the report, I use it as kind of I can cite something else, not just me saying this too, right? As a way of saying assessment is not just about the data set that's like a quantitative data set. The stories count, right? How can we better tell this authentically? I think you say the stories of the work. And I think, Eric, what you're hitting on too is like, we can have like a data set, we can have all this stuff. People don't respond to that. They respond to like an emotional connection and feeling of stories usually. And I think the democratically engaged process of assessment, or just more broadly, would call or create checkpoints to say, what social change? Yep. It's not defined by Nora what the social change is, or defined by Eric what the social change is, but that it necessarily creates that process of engagement to, in a participatory way, maybe push back on what social change I think is needed, and highlight gaps in my thinking, right? And those perspectives of what would successful social change be, or positive social change be. So to me, it creates like that process too of checkpoints of who defines success or positive social change. Those are like some of my takeaways, I think, from like reading the piece.
I mean, Faith had a nice comment in the chat as well, thinking about students who are traditionally excluded. So if you have alternate ways of assessing student learning, or if you have curated ways for the students to express their own identity creation and learning, in that instance, right, you start making a norm that participatory expectation too. And so while you may not have set out on a goal for change per se of an entire system, maybe you're just thinking like, there's this one student that I need to open up more in my class, or that I want them to feel safe enough to be able to fully participate. That question can snowball into something so much greater too. So I appreciate and wanted to highlight Faith's comment as how student learning could lead to change, or student assessment can lead to change.
One more thought on this, Eric. You're sending my mind back also to, you remember that article that you and I and another 8 people co-authored for the Journal of Applied Learning in Higher Ed about basically walking the talk and stuff? I think this issue was part of the tension that we held in writing that article. And so I want to go read it again. The change the system by marching on Washington kind of thing. And then, you know, George Hess's by the design of the first day of class. So you remember you and I talked a bit about how you had the question, what does the design of the first day of class have to do with social justice? Right. And we were trying to, in that article, I think, hold that tension. And I remember Lori Niffen, you know, sort of helped me think about that. What we need to do is walk a bridge between what people experience through a democratically engaged design of the first day of class, or of the workshop, or of the March on Washington, or whatever else, right? That they're micro, they're macro, and Joe's taught me some about micro and macro and movement. But anyway, you pushed me back to that article. I want to go look at that again for how we had different contexts in which trying to walk the talk of democratic engaged was thought to be generative of change toward democracy, justice, etc. Need to bring that back in.
This is, as I said in the chat, wonderfully good fun. We're at the, I think, end of time, right? Actually, this is my day off, so like time's meaningless to me, but I want to respect the rest of you. But yeah, just with the collaborative, we end our mission statement with for the co-creation of just, inclusive, sustainable communities. And we try to draw attention to some values, and I would say my language on this is recognize that we're situated in spaces that hold some values above others. And and I don't know how to wiggle out of that. And maybe, but that's just, yeah. I mean, this is more of like, I can't wait to talk to y'all more about this kind of comment. That's how we sat with that.
Excellent.
Thank you. I don't know
Well,
who's
thank
saying
you.
the closing.
Thank you for
thank
coming,
you.
Eric.
That's me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, couldn't miss it. This is amazing. Just really appreciate it.
Excellent.
So thank you all, Joe, Sarah, Patti, thank you for being willing to facilitate the conversation today and share with us so much of the work that you've been doing over years and years and years. I personally have learned a lot from it, and I know it's informed a lot of folks who are involved in the collaborative network. So we hope that this is but a moment of conversation. It is a continued conversation and ways to think together and learn together as we step forward. There are many of those tensions we've hit on today, but continue to struggle with as we try to move forward. So thank you all.
Thank you.
And I will be in touch to follow up about some of the additional resources. But I will just say thank you and wonderful to see you all.